There are so many people out there that are upset and angry and frustrated and confused about how do we collectively become a more just and equitable world for everybody. And while this can sound like too large of a task for some, Dr. Melanie Joy, PhD, has written a book called How to End Injustice Everywhere. In this book, she is speaking to the common denominator driving all forms of injustice. She offers an examination of unjust systems and behaviors, as well as practical tools to help raise awareness, reduce infighting, and build more resilient and impactful justice movements. Honestly, this book has moved me. It is profound. The interview that you're about to hear with Dr. Melanie Joy, she is one of the most interesting thought leaders that I have spoken to. Not only is she incredibly intelligent and well-spoken, but you can tell from speaking to her that she is attempting to live out her message from the heart and the mind. And I do believe that you will learn something new in this interview and possibly be moved to purchase her book in the future or borrow it from the library. Just a little bit about Dr. Melanie Joy, PhD, before we get to the interview. She is an award-winning psychologist specializing in the psychology of oppression and social transformation and in relationships. She is a longtime advocate for justice and was a lecturer at University of Massachusetts, Boston for 11 years, where she taught courses on privilege and oppression, feminist psychology, psychological trauma, and animal rights. She has written 7 books, including the best-selling Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows. And she's the 8th recipient of the Ashima Award, previously given to the Dalai Lama and Nelson Mandela for her global work on non-violence. She's also the founding president of the international NGO called Beyond Carnism, and you can learn more at melaniejoy.org. All right, let's get to the interview. Hello, and welcome to the podcast, Dr. Melanie Joy. I'm really excited to have you today.
Oh, thank you. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, it's my pleasure. And I have been just loving your book, How to End Injustice Everywhere, Understanding the Common Denominator Driving All Injustices to Create a Better World for Humans, Animals, and the Planet. And I must say, when I first saw the title, I was taken aback because this seems like quite a big job. But then when I was reading it, I thought, oh my gosh, this boils down to both a couple of simple paradigms that are difficult to implement, but also it's very complicated. Obviously, there's not like a simple solution here, but there are some things we can do. So I'm excited to ask you about it. And I do think this is a book that listeners will want to pick up because I have a lot of people that listen to my podcast on the psychology realm and the sociology realm, and also activists who you do work with frequently. So thank you for writing this.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I did want to start with a little bit of the simple stuff before we go to our main talking points today, which is that you're writing in here that it seems like a lot of the injustices and power dynamic problems and these like longstanding cultural issues that persist with oppression and sort of hurting people are you frame it from partly the relational aspect that occurs between people and cultures and different entities. And I feel like that's important to define before we go into some of the other ones. Can you kind of explain about the paradigm a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you think about, some of the most pressing problems in our world today, and also in our, in our personal lives, like, war, poverty, racism, patriarchy, animal exploitation, environmental degradation, domestic violence, toxic workplaces. I mean, the list goes on and on, you can see that they all share a common denominator. And, there are multiple common denominators, but one that is, really, really important to look at and is not being talked about very widely at this point in time is relational dysfunction. or basically dysfunctional ways of relating between social groups, between humans and non-human animals, between humans and the environment, among people in workplaces, and also between us and ourselves. We're always relating to ourselves, through our self-talk, or the choices that we make that impact our future selves. So, relational dysfunction is this common denominator, underlying all of these various problems and frankly, injustices in general. And what that means is that a common denominator in resolving all of these problems is building relational literacy, which I define as the understanding of and ability to practice healthy ways of relating. And relational dysfunction is, it's a behavior, right? But it reflects a mentality, right? So at the core of all forms of injustice, and this is where, if you really want to boil it down to its absolute core, at the core of all expressions, forms, behaviors of injustice is a particular mentality. And this is a mentality that, we'll unpack and talk about, but this is a mentality that drives us to relate in ways that are relationally dysfunctional, that drives us to do things that cause harm, that create disconnections, that create insecurity, that create unjust power imbalances. And so that's sort of like the simplest summary, right? The same, I guess, to drive this point home, the very same mentality that causes us to exploit human beings, causes us to exploit non-human beings. This is also the same mentality that causes infighting in the very movements that have emerged, social justice movements, to try to end injustice. And it's the same mentality that causes, what we could call toxic communication and, problematic interpersonal dynamics. So really what I look at in the book is like, what is this? I call this the non-relational mentality. So really look at this mentality and look at these relational behaviors. What's healthy? What's not healthy? How are we socialized to act in ways that are not healthy? And how can we change our thinking so that we can create healthier, more resilient systems, social systems, family systems, and so on.
Yes. And I want to try to give a couple examples for the listener because it really does boil down to a quite simple concept that you talk about in here about when humans, according to polyvagal theory, humans have a desire to be connected, to feel with others and the environment, to feel safe, and I can't remember the third one, but basically to belong to something, essentially. To a group. We're pod animals, according to that theory, and so that can be a basic driver. But in that, there becomes more complicated because you're talking about how I don't want to butcher this, but basically something about reflecting integrity and honoring dignity in yourself and others leads to connection and security. Am I hitting that right?
Yeah. Yeah, I can explain this a little bit. It's, what you're talking about is, I was mentioning relational literacy, and relational literacy is made up of a number of principles and tools, but they're all based on this key formula. And I did this like a deep dive into, really looking at all of the theories of healthy human relating, healthy relationality. And, we can boil it down to what a healthy relational dynamic looks like, or we even say a healthy interaction looks like, is what I call this the formula for healthy relating. It's just a very simplified version, right? We, in any healthy interaction or healthy relationship, and I mean, a relationship is basically just a series of interactions, right? We practice integrity and honor dignity. And this leads to a sense of greater security and greater connection. And I'm going to unpack this a little bit for listeners who want to know what I mean when I talk about integrity and dignity.
Oh, good point.
So integrity is, it's the integration of our core values, moral values, and our practices, right? And so research has shown that people across cultures, the most commonly espoused values are the values of compassion, or otherwise known as caring, and justice, otherwise known as fairness. So when I'm talking about practicing integrity, I'm basically talking about practicing these two core values. We can boil this down even further and say it's practicing the golden rule. It's treating others the way that you would want to be treated if you were in their position. And honoring dignity requires unpacking or defining the word dignity. Dignity is our sense of inherent worth, right? When we feel dignity, we feel that we're a fundamentally worthy being, that, we're no less worthy of being treated with respect or of occupying space on this planet than anybody else. So when you practice integrity and honor dignity, this leads, you think about relationships in your own life, this leads to a greater sense of security and connection in your relationship or in your dynamic. And whether you're practicing this formula, toward yourself or toward another individual who's a human, toward another animal, we can practice it collectively as well. And this formula, like most things in life, it's not either or. It exists on a spectrum, right? So an interaction can be more or less relational or healthy, or non-relational, dysfunctional, right? And non-relational behaviors are the opposite. In non-relational behaviors, we violate integrity and harm dignity. And this causes a sense of insecurity and disconnection. And there have been a number of studies that have been done, really looking at basically demonstrating that we are hardwired to seek meaningful connections with others, and we're hardwired to avoid the pain of disconnection. So this is really the core of what I'm talking about. When I'm talking about a healthy relational behavior, it's one that reflects the formula, and an unhealthy behavior, a non-relational behavior, is the one that reflects the opposite of the formula.
Yes, and I appreciate you defining that. And I'm going to give a few examples from my anecdotal brain and also your book. But essentially, it for me, it starts with children. And recently, I was talking to some professors from UC Irvine about how when you go to school and you start getting feedback on certain ways of getting feedback, like they've changed it now, but when I was in fourth grade, here's the gifted advanced readers, and here's the remedial readers, and here's the regular readers. And like literally that was in fourth grade, I was in the advanced reading. I felt very privileged for that. And then it got worse. They actually assigned a child who was not good at reading for me to read to them, which was humiliating. I'm assuming to them at the time, I didn't think anything of it except, wow, I feel so special. I get to read to this person and help them. Right. But then I'm thinking, oh my gosh, they were labeled. So we were talking about the way that kids get labeled in school and how this can affect their entire story of who they are, their self-esteem, their earning potential, who they decide to, if they decide to be with somebody, all sorts of aspects just from getting feedback that is a bit non-relational. Right. So not, obviously in school, you have to get grades and you have to earn, whatever, you have to compete, so to speak. That's the way we've set up the system. But what we're talking about in this particular conversation was kindergarten and first grade and second grade, where we don't really know what people's potentials are yet. And yet we're sorting them into these groups. And in that way, maybe well-intentioned by educators, it's a non-relational way. It's not honoring them all as having, unique skill sets that, perhaps little Joey or Tommy is really good at pottery, but they've never had the chance to express that self, and they're not that good at math, and so they get labeled in the low math class, right? So this goes on, and humans we're meaning-making creatures. We love meaning. We're obsessed with it. In fact, in evolution, which is a whole other, you can read Sapiens, we believe Homo sapiens won because they were able to get a larger group, to believe a story. And that story then helped them conquer other groups and, whatever, fight off mountain lions or whatever it was that they were doing at the time. So essentially, humans believe these stories about ourselves from experiences, and some of the experiences that keep getting perpetuated, like brutalism towards each other, infighting, toxic communication. These things are in the culture; they're inherited, and There's plenty of people working to work on themselves and to work on their family or their friends and try to learn more healthy ways of relating. That's a trend, but there's also the opposite trend that is kind of by default happening. And an easy example that you talked about was when you killed something when you were a little kid and you went fishing. And before that, you had been on the boat and been all happy. This is me summarizing your life, but I had a similar experience. So I'm bringing that juxtaposition up. And and then when you got the fish, you reeled it in. Oh, this is so fun. I'm 4 years old or something. All of a sudden you realize this fish is no longer in its habitat. It is gasping for oxygen and dying in the boat. And then we are going to hit it on the head and fillet it and eat it. And this is murder, essentially. And I know that some of our listeners may go, well, you have to eat to survive meat. That's not what we're talking about. Just hear the example out. There is a part of us, the innocent part of our child self, that saw it for what it was. And this is harming another living being. And I had that same experience. But what happened to you probably happened to me, which was everyone said, well, this is what we've always done. You have to hit the fish on the head so they don't die, they don't suffer for too long. And then we cut their body up and then we put it on the grill and then it tastes delicious. And that's how you get protein. That's the only way to get protein is this way. And we've been doing this for thousands of years and don't question it. And I remember feeling in my gut when my grandfather filleted 40 bluegills in front of me at a young age. I was like, oh, I don't like this. This is wrong. And then he's like, he said, and he was well-intentioned. He's like, well, if you're going to eat the fish, you've got to know where it comes from and you've got to be able to kill it and you've got to be able to fillet it because it's not fair if you just go to the supermarket, like he was trying to give me a lesson about how it should be, and just buy it off the shelf. You should have to work for it and honor the fact that this fish died for you. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that's a whole nother myth, to unpack later. But essentially, it's this feeling inside that I think young children mostly have, which is when something doesn't feel good in our heart, we can sense it. But culture and trends and peer pressure and family pressure and stories that we are being told suppress our natural feelings of what is right and wrong. And we're shaped by the culture. And, racism is an easy example. Like as a young kid, I remember one of my other grandfather said something racist because he had been in World War II and he didn't like Japanese people because his brother had died in Japan fighting the Japanese people. And he was killed by a Japanese person. So he had a thing against Japanese people. And I remember thinking, I didn't know his whole history, but I remember him saying a comment. And I said, oh, that's not right. They're just people like us. And I remember saying that to him. And he didn't have a rebuttal because I didn't know his whole history at that point. But he just said, oh, well, yeah. Well, So I felt that, right? But if I had been in an earlier age, this was the 80s, I may have actually just gone along with that and said, yes, you're right. They're the enemy and we're the good people. And I would have kind of taken that black and white paradigm. So I go on this long story to explain to people that are listening that there's a feeling inside when you're in connection and you're in harmony with your core values. And the core value I hear is that life is sacred. I'm hearing that come through. And that's not what you said, but then.
Well, close. I would say the core value is probably, the closest one I can think of is compassion, and
okay.
honoring dignity. But people can interpret that in different ways, and underneath that core value is something else, and that is empathy. And to your point, we really do get these non-relational systems, which you're just actually describing now. We talked about the spectrum of, healthy and dysfunctional relating the relational health spectrum. Not only do behaviors exist on this spectrum, like a behavior can be more or less relational or non-relational. And you use some good examples to show that. And one of the very common ways, probably the most common way, and at least in a lot of places in Western culture, around the world today, is for non-relational behaviors to get expressed is through shaming. And we can talk about that a little bit later, even very subtle shaming behaviors. But not only do behaviors exist on this spectrum, but so do systems. a system can be more or less relational or non-relational. And, a relational system is one that's organized around honoring, dignity and practicing integrity. And within the system, the proponents or the participants in the system feel more secure and connected with one another. And you can think about like a family system or a couple system, the smallest, a dyadic system, where there's real integrity practiced in that system, and the people within that system feel more secure and connected with each other. And also power is more balanced. You don't have one person wielding power over another, creating a power imbalance and growing the power imbalance, right? So if you look at a non-relational dyadic system, like a couple system, which would be, you could say, an abusive relationship, this is the opposite of a relational one. And, there's one person typically that is wielding power and control over the other, creating a power imbalance, and that power imbalance is growing over time. Larger systems can also be non-relational. So, oppressive systems, what we call oppressive systems or unjust systems, are what I would call non-relational systems: racism, patriarchy, and, to your point that you were talking about, carnism. And this is where I think it could be easy for us to use examples that listeners can, so listeners can connect with these ideas that we're talking about so that they're not too abstract. So you're talking about, being a child and feeling your, natural empathy, like I did, when I was killed the fish, feeling your natural empathy for other animals. I mean, most children, love other animals. They want to pet them. They want to touch them. And, we know in psychology that a child who is, actively trying to harm animals, like that is a sign of potential psychological problems currently and also down the road. We know that. Like, we know to teach our children to be kind to animals and not to harm animals, and that's instilling in them a really important set of values. As they say, teaching a child to, or as the saying goes, and I forgot who said this, teaching a child not to step on a caterpillar is almost as important for the child as it is for the caterpillar. So, and yet at the same time, we are socialized excuse me, from the moment that we are weaned, we're socialized from the moment we are weaned to disconnect from our natural empathy from those animals who we've learned to classify as edible. And this is where we can see the psychology of this non-relational psychology coming into play. And there are a whole host of, like, I can actually give you an example if if you're ready to have this conversation, so that listeners can have a really concrete example of what I'm talking about and how non-relational systems get played out in our own lives.
Sure, I'd love that. And do you mind if I make a comment real quick about the carnism?
Yeah,
and then you can go right to your point. I wanted to point out that I believe you wrote a book. Was it called Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows? Is that what it was called?
Yeah, that book grew into, and that's actually what I'm going to explain to people, like what that actually means for them.
Okay.
But that book was actually the foundation for how to end injustice everywhere. So let me start out and just do a thought experiment with you, right? So like you just like imagine, and for listeners as well, of course, imagine that you are, you're out to dinner and you bite into a juicy hamburger and you turn to your dining companion who looks at you and then suddenly tells you that the meat in that hamburger is actually not beef. It's made from golden retrievers. Now, chances are, right? Let's talk about thoughts, which drive feelings, which drive behaviors. Okay. So chances are what you had just thought of as food, you now think of as a dead animal. And what you had just felt was delicious, you now feel is disgusting. And so therefore, rather than continuing to eat the hamburger, you probably want to throw it in the trash and maybe even take to the streets in protest. So this is because golden retrievers, dogs are not appreciably different from other animals in certain fundamental ways, at least in the respect that most people care about, right? They're intelligent, they're sentient, they're conscious individuals. But we haven't been conditioned by a non-relational system, right? To disconnect, to distort our perceptions and disconnect from our natural empathy for golden retrievers or for dogs. So your experience eating the golden retriever is really your authentic experience. Your experience eating other forms of meat or eggs or dairy is your conditioned experience. You are the system that I came to call carnism after doing my doctoral research on the psychology of eating animals. The non-relational system conditions you to have distorted perceptions that disconnect you from your natural empathy so that you act against your integrity. Like most people, at least psychologically healthy people, care about other animals and would never want to willingly cause them to suffer, especially when that suffering is so intensive and actually completely unnecessary. And yet most people do this multiple times a day without having any idea that they're acting against their core values and their own interests and the interests of others and the interests of the planet. And so this is the way that non-relational systems operate. They condition us to think in certain ways so that we support the system without realizing what we're doing.
Yes, and I think I want to drive that example home with an example I have. I worked in social services in Phoenix, and long story short, I'm changing all the details of this so that it's not revealing anything. But oftentimes, the probation department of Phoenix police would mandate people to come see therapists. And the interesting case that came about, and I'm changing this, was there was an individual who had killed 2 dogs. And they felt that this individual was possibly going to be a sociopath and wanted us to work with this individual. Now, when we spoke to this individual, they felt remorse and sad about killing the dogs and had gotten, quote, carried away. But what they neglected the context was that this individual lived on a farm outside of the city and routinely was asked to slaughter pigs, cows, and chickens for his family / boss or whatever. I don't remember the whole situation. And this was normal to him. And I don't know. I didn't do the full evaluation. I don't think he was a sociopath, but it was just odd to me that if we had switched one of the animals around in this scenario, that he would have not been thought of as a sociopath for murdering, I don't know, hundreds of cows or pigs or chickens. But the moment that he, in his, I don't remember what he said. So I think he felt the dog was going to attack him or whatever, and he killed the dog. The whole society, the system, the probation, the police, the psychology, gets involved and goes, oh my gosh, this is a warning sign. Because we know from literature, when children abuse and hurt animals, I mean, most children will accidentally pull a cat's tail or hit a dog by, and then they learn, oh, don't do that. That's mean. That hurts them. They have feelings. They're just, they're similar to us. I just don't speak our language or whatever. And we start to learn that. But if they keep doing it, then we say, uh-oh, something's going on here. They might have violent tendencies. They may not have empathy. That's dangerous. That could be sociopathic, which could mean they could lead to hurting humans. So I want you to go into your example, but I wanted to point out how the system came down so hard on this person for something to them that was culturally or contextually somewhat normal. Can you? Yeah. So I don't know if that helps.
I mean, totally. It's a great example, and it highlights a really important distinction. So first of all, it is, I mean, there is this wild paradox, right? Where we are really conditioned to support the slaughter of, trillions of certain types of animals every year and consume their bodies, and to not really ever think twice about that. And yet, if the same thing were done to a different species, we would consider that to be absolutely horrific. And so this is very, obviously it's very paradoxical. That's the reality of non-relational systems. They're actually nonsensical systems as well. They condition us to think in a very, very compartmentalized way. So, and at the same time, there is a psychological difference between a child who is seeking out an animal, whatever that species may be, whether it's a chicken, whether they're a chicken or a pig or a cow or a dog, because they're enjoying causing that animal to suffer, versus somebody who is killing animals because they've been conditioned to kill animals, whatever their species may be. And herein lies the important part of this conversation. Like, what kind of society are we looking to create? I mean, we know as people who are, psychological professionals, when we are conditioning people to really psychologically numb themselves such that they are able to carry out or support violent practices that are completely against their core values, that they actually would be deeply opposed to if they were truly aware of them. We need to really have a conversation about this and what this is doing to us, and it's not just with animals. I mean, I write about this in How to End Injustice. This is what non-relational systems do. They condition us to put others in compartments, and we decide like who we're going to feel empathy for and support, and whose dignity we're going to honor, and who has a right to occupy space on this planet and not to be harmed, and who is, considered, what's the word I'm looking for, who's an exception to that. So, like, let me explain the way this sort of psychology that I'm talking about, this non-relational mentality, and I think it'll make this conversation clearer for listeners who are kind of like wondering, okay, well, what's going on? How does this operate? What are these mental gymnastics that we're talking about here? So, and I'll back up and also say that I was, for much of my life, I ate meat and I ate, pigs and chickens and cows and cheese. And I was like the meat lover's pizza girl, and I was also a person who cared about, the well-being of other sentient beings. I had this dog who I loved like a family member. I would never have wanted to support what I came to realize was going on in the world. I ended up getting sick one day from eating contaminated hamburger, and I wound up on intravenous antibiotics. And I could not eat meat again after that. And it wasn't any kind of a rational decision or an ethical decision. It was visceral. I was just like, when you've been wildly ill, the last thing that you ate, you never want to go back to. So I became like, eventually I became vegan, and it was, started out as vegetarian kind of by accident. And in the process of learning this, and this was back in the 80s, I was 23, it was 89. And, there was not a lot of awareness about this issue then, but in the process of like learning how to cook for myself and, how to shop for myself as this kind of new vegetarian, I of course stumbled upon information about animal agriculture. And what I learned, completely shocked and horrified me, what was happening to the animals, what was happening to the environment. And back then climate change wasn't even a real conversation that was being had, but still what was happening to human health, I was completely shocked and horrified. But what shocked me in some ways even more was that nobody I talked to about what I was learning was willing to hear what I had to say. And, it would always be something like, don't tell me that you'll ruin my meal, or they'd call me a radical, vegan hippie propagandist. And I became very curious as to how, these are my friends and family members. They were rational people. They were compassionate people, just like myself. Some of them were working in psychology, and, they were doctors. And I'm like, what is going on here? This defensiveness, I don't understand. And so that's what led me to actually study the psychology of violence and nonviolence more broadly, but also the psychology of eating animals, and to conclude that there is this invisible belief system that I came to call carnism, which is a non-relational system that conditions us to eat certain animals and to feel defensive against anyone or anything that would help get us out of the box that we don't even realize we're in. And that's where this resistance, came from. And that was the basis of my work. And what I discovered is that, this system, and I'm using this as an example because in How to End Injustice, I've expanded this work to talk about all non-relational systems because they're all structured in the same way, and they all reflect the same mentality. But I want to be really clear here, and I am not comparing the victims of these systems. The experience of each set of victims will always be unique. But what I am saying is that the mentality that drives the injustice and the violence is the same. And that is where I think we have an ethical obligation as people who are, particularly people who are working in and interested in psychology, to really start to have these conversations and unravel these issues. Because at the end of the day, this is it's about politics, it's about economics, it's about power. Of course it is. And on a deeper level, it's about how we think. It is about our mentality. And that is where the conversation needs to happen. And what I came to realize is that, carnism, which is essentially the opposite of veganism, is structured. It has to keep itself alive, and it's got to, like other systems, coerce people who would normally not support it into supporting it, without realizing what they're doing. And what it does is it uses a set of psychological defense mechanisms. And these defense mechanisms distort our perceptions and disconnect us from our natural empathy. In this case, it's for farmed animals. And so, just as an example, because these same defenses are used to support all non-relational systems, carnism teaches us to see farmed animals as abstractions, lacking any personality or, characteristic of their own. So a pig is a pig and all pigs are the same. These are psychological distancing mechanisms, or we learn to see farmed animals as objects. So we learn to refer to the chicken on our plate as something rather than someone. And we internalize these defenses, and these defenses are built right into our social institutions. So when we study nutrition, we're actually studying carnistic nutrition. And I'm using carnism because, we started talking about this as an example, but all of these, we've internalized this defensiveness and these distorted ways of thinking when it comes to all unjust systems, unjust systems that harm humans as well as non-humans.
Yes, I appreciate that. And I feel like the point hopefully is ringing true to people, because we're trying to talk about the relational aspects that you talk about in how to end injustice everywhere. And I wanted to maybe bring some of the issues of injustice we're facing, maybe in with humans for a moment, to maybe give some examples here. And then we were going to talk about privilege, but I feel like, well, that's the cherry on top. So I kind of want to just hear about how some of these systems and institutions that we've created, maybe with good intentions, act in non-relational ways and like basically continue human suffering. And I love that you said this, and I think this is a key point: disconnection from your empathy, compartmentalization, right? These systems utilize that to disconnect you from, maybe this is a bit out there, but I think they disconnect you from having your own thoughts and your own personal autonomy and choices, because you must comply with these systems or be shamed. And when you comply with these systems, you are often rewarded. So can you kind of maybe give a couple other examples of what we're talking about to bring it from the abstract to the personal for people? Because we did talk about the animals. I kind of want to talk about maybe, I don't know, the justice system or, patriarchy or something like that. Something that is good for you to dive into.
Yeah, I mean, I can share an example I'll share a personal example that I think that'll be less abstract for people. So, with patriarchy, which again, but all of these non-relational systems, they use this like two-pronged strategic approach to keep themselves alive. Essentially, they need to maintain or create. They need to get people to believe in their narratives, in their stories, right?
Yes.
One individual or one group, is superior to another, is better than another, essentially. I mean, if you think about this, they're all organized around what a core belief. They all share a core foundational belief, which I refer to as the myth of the hierarchy of moral worth, that there are certain individuals are more worthy of moral consideration, of basically having their dignity honored than others. So whether we're talking about animals or farmed animals, or we're talking about white people, or we're talking about, male people, or we're talking about wealthy people, whatever it may be, it all comes down to this core sort of myth. And the hierarchy of moral worth also drives, outside of these broader social systems, drives us to engage in non-relational behaviors, even when we are, interacting in our workplace, for example, or interacting with our romantic partner. Like generally, when you treat somebody non-relationally, when you're mad at your partner, and you lash out at them and you say something to them that's non-relational, you put them down, you shame them, like however that shows up, it can show up in a gazillion different ways. In that moment, you are operating from this belief in a hierarchy of moral worth, that I am more worthy of you at this moment, having my dignity honored. Like you have, for whatever reason, because of what you have done, you have forfeited your right for me to be treating you with respect. So,
yes.
and we look at patriarchy. I have had in my work, working with different types of activists, and I was with a group of animal justice activists actually, and it was out to a lunch, and it was with all men and me, and these were all activists. I mean, talk about compartmentalization, and obviously not all people who are working for animal justice or veganism in this case, it was actually are thinking this way, but. Just because we've made the connection, between whatever the formula and non-human animals doesn't mean that you've made that connection with how you should treat other humans. Just like a lot of human rights activists, still eat animals in the process of, working for human rights. So you can see this compartmentalization. It's a normal process, and we're all doing it. Anyway, so I was out with this group of men who were like very progressive-minded men having a vegan meal, a vegan lunch, and I was actually talking to them. At one point, we started talking about patriarchy, and I was explaining how I had just been doing some consulting at an organization, and this was before me too. There was an older male staff person in a fairly high up position of power who commented on an 18-year-old intern's legs in her short skirt in front of other people, and it was very awkward. I was there. It was very awkward. The women were very uncomfortable, and the men had kind of laughed along with it, and there was some eye rolling, and that was that. Nobody kind of stood up. Nobody said anything. I talked to the person afterwards, but the men at the table all started debating me. And rather than listening to me, they started debating me. Now, this is a lot less likely to happen today. This was back in 2015, but they were pointing out how, maybe I had misread what was going on. Maybe she was flattered by having that comment. And not for one moment did a person pause and actually take my opinion as a woman. And we were talking about patriarchy as a woman, as seriously as they were taking the other men's opinions in this conversation. And they had, I think, in this moment, had reduced me in their minds. And this is what happens. One aspect of the non-relational mentality is what I call reductive thinking, where we suddenly reduce somebody to just sort of a caricature of a behavior or an attitude or something that we've made generalized assumptions about. I think they had suddenly reduced me to that feminist. And that was that. And so it's, this mentality shows up in just so many different ways. I often, when I'm communicating and I give trainings in effective advocacy, and this is another example of patriarchy expressing itself. So I have a PhD. I've done a tremendous amount of research. I've published 7 books, and one of my key areas of expertise is on relationships and communication and effective advocacy, effective communication, and it's not uncommon for me to get, debated or argued with online for having too much of a soft approach, because I'm talking about how important it is not to engage in shaming behaviors. There's a vast, vast body of literature, that demonstrates that shaming somebody creates the opposite outcomes of what we want. When you put somebody down, even if it's really subtle shaming, and we can talk about that a little bit if you want, but suddenly I'm called soft, and and then hotly debated on my approach. And I have no problem with people questioning and sharing opinions, and I know that I can very easily be wrong about things, like we all can. But the reaction, this is almost 100% of the time, is from men who are, I'm 57 and they're 23. And insisting that I'm just being too soft, kind, I'm afraid of conflict, and whatever other kind of sort of feminized version of the story emerges. So I don't know if those are helpful anecdotes for you, but that's...
Yeah, they are. And I do want to talk about shame, but I want to I want to say a confession, and I think about and my experience growing up. I think it just in an odd way that I didn't realize how much the patriarchy had affected my thinking. Uh, I do remember rebelling in middle school against the guys who were putting down girls. I remember thinking, that's stupid. They're smarter than you. And I like hanging out with them. And so I started hanging out with the girls to talk about stuff at lunch that actually made sense. And I remember I was physically assaulted by the males for sitting at the lunch table. They would punch you in the shoulder. This is a thing you could get away with back in the 90s, where it wasn't really bullying. It was just guys being guys. And that's another patriarchal concept. And I remember getting punched, and then some of the girls felt uncomfortable. They're like, well, we like talking to you, but since you're sitting at our table, now everyone's jealous of you. And now we don't know if we can have you here because you're not a girl, and you should be sitting with the more male tables or the mixed tables. And this is our girl talk. And I'm like, yeah, but I don't want to talk to them right now. I'm like kind of against this. And I remember just the whole confusion I had, but then also these messages I was getting about women did not line up with my experience of women. I got messages from older males, friends, dads, radio shows that I didn't know what they were, television, that women were too emotional, hysterical, non-logical, easily manipulated, dangerous. The Bible, Eve ate the apple and the snake convinced her, and then Adam, we're all screwed because of that. All these sort of weird messages. I remember just being like, what the hell is this? Because my mom, I love my mom, and she's smart as hell, and she's a businesswoman, and she goes out and does amazing things, and people respect her, right? But these patriarchal things were not only damaging towards women, because in some parts of my life, I definitely acted on these concepts and were mean to women. And I apologized, I was. But I also felt that they were damaging towards men because they kept me from being truly intimate. And I don't mean sexually, with some women in my life, including my relatives, my mom, even girls at school. They kept me from having an intimate relationship until I was old enough, I guess, mature enough to realize what was going on. And now I have very intimate relationships with different women in my life, including my partner. Because of these sort of weird concepts I was being fed through the culture that I didn't know I was absorbing. And I felt like they're also hurting men. The patriarchy hurts men because then it isolates us men to think of women as objects. And If you treat a woman like an object in a relationship, that's a horrible relationship. That's not a relationship, right? And in fact, having an intimate relationship with a woman is a good thing, because in some ways, obviously, they're socialized differently than males and have different skills and whatever. I don't know exactly why. That's a whole nother topic. But in some ways, we do think about things differently based on socialization, I guess. And that can be very useful to have a perspective that is not my perspective. And that actually can help me grow as a male, right? And so I say that because it took me a long time to realize how indoctrinated I was, even though I was consistently resisting these messages. I still picked them up. And that's how insidious these systems are. By sitting at this lunch table with girls, I had broken a norm. And I was accused of all sorts of things, like he's clearly gay. He must be gay because only gay guys would sit with the girls at lunch. Or do you want to be a woman? I was like, what? No, I just don't like your conversation over here about violence and sports. And I want to talk to them about books. That was my intention at the time, and being 10, 12 years old or whatever. So I want to talk about that because the messages are just insidious, but it goes to something that's been going on for a long time, which is not just oppression, but I think the men don't think of it that way. I think they don't even realize that it's a hanging on to power. The power. And that goes back to, if we could go, we're not going to do a history lesson, but women were property and marriages were not about love. They were about you know, whatever, political alliances and farming and you know, making a bunch of children because a bunch of them would die from plagues, and they weren't considered a full human. And then and then there's so many men that are in favor of, you know, treating women with respect that are still racist. It's just bizarre. They're like, well, you know, my wife, she's amazing. I'm very pro women. And they have a daughter, perhaps, that converted them to this thinking. But they're like, but those people across the border, they shouldn't be here. Right. It's like, what? Like,
yeah, and this is such a good point that you raise, and you do such a good job of like highlighting again more of these lines and more of these ways of compartmentalizing. And you know, where, you know, people will say to me, where do you draw your line around your circle of compassion? And I always say it doesn't matter where I draw my line. It's like, it's how I relate to my line that matters. You know, we're always learning, and draw your line in pencil. And, you know, people think, you know, animal rights activists sometimes think, or justice activists, they think, you know, it's a final frontier. You know, this is animals are the final frontier. And, you know, once you've got the animal rights picture in your mind, then, you know, then that's it. But no, because there are plenty of people who are working for animals who are not supporting human rights. There are people who are like actively working for social justice and then demeaning, publicly berating people who disagree with them, you know, or people out there trying to create a better world and then coming home to their families and being bullies, and, you know, people who are great bosses, but then, you know, don't treat their friends well. So there's no limit to, you know, how we compartmentalize. And to your point as well with patriarchy, one of the things that I, you know, really hope people take away from the book is that, you know, to really open up this conversation and reduce defensiveness around it, because we are all so deeply socialized. You know, we have all had our psyches basically completely hijacked by myriad systems, you know, that we're not aware of, and we're on a learning journey. And, you know, as long as we believe or we fail to recognize that good people can participate in harmful practices, and that doesn't make them bad people. If we don't recognize this, we're going to be so defensive against examining our own privilege that we have, that we're never going to be able to be open to this conversation, that we all need to be having this collective conversation, this collective learning, because you internalized patriarchy just like I have, and I've internalized racism just like, you know, everybody has. And we are, you know, we're all fallible human beings, and we, you know, another reason that we need psychology to be joining this conversation more fully is to be helping to provide the tools with which we can communicate and relate to each other effectively and bypass this defensiveness.
Yeah, and you know, in psychotherapy, the current version, or the version that I like the most, is that a person comes in with a problem, and what we often say in therapy is the problem is not the problem. The problem is a microcosm or a example or a harbinger of what is behind it. It is the weed that has grown out. But by the way, the weed, I just said weed. Weeds don't exist. They are just categorized as weeds because us Americans love to pull them and not have lots of varieties of plants. We only want certain plants. So anyway, that's a whole nother topic. But you know, that socialized again, yeah. Right? So, you know, I always say one man's myth is another person's religion. You know, I mean, it's the same thing. So it's like, my point is the plant has grown, and we don't like this plant. And they're coming in because of this plant growing in their life. They're like, oh, I'm so angry about this, or why do I always date this person? You know, I hear that from different people. Why do I always date this type of person? The answer isn't on the surface. It's always beneath the surface. And what do we find beneath the surface? Traumatic experiences that may not be PTSD, okay, but they are traumatic adverse experiences. Traumatic experiences for sure, PTSD, problems that happen to us, messages, disappointments, emotional issues, possibly biological, social issues, oppression, all of the things that affect humans, biopsychosocial, spiritual, sexual, contextual, etc., are all contributing in some way or another in a strange Rubik's Cube kind of puzzle. For every person, it's a little different as to what some of the driving factors are. But if people take the time and have the resources and the energy and the space and the safety to explore these issues that they brought to the surface that have grown out of the ground, oftentimes we can get into the roots. And when we get into the roots, and EMDR therapy and trauma-informed really does a great job, other forms of talk therapy do as well, that person can start to feel freedom from the socialization, from the trauma, from the distorted thinking, from the habits they've developed that they don't see as healthy. They start to get freedom, and all of a sudden, what happens? It's not just that their symptoms have reduced. Their relationships have improved with other people. Their habits have improved. What they spend their time thinking about has become, in a way, people notice and say, wow, they're just positive. They're thinking about ways to help people in the world, and they're trying to love people, and they're being nice to the person in the supermarket they were never nice to before. These little subtle things start to happen because they're in alignment now with their heart. The damage has been somewhat repaired. And so part of all this, it starts with us. The problem is the problems and these systems and the non-relational thinking and the compartmentalization and the shaming and the programming that you grew up in didn't start with you. It did not start with you. The problem is the systems, the same systems that oppress you also tell you you're the problem a lot of the times. If you have a complaint about eating animals, if you have a complaint about the justice system, if you have a complaint about the way women are treated, if you have a complaint about the way men are treated, the problem is you, obviously, not the system or the thinking patterns that we have been installed and grown up with. And there is the shame, and there is the confusion. And quite frankly, that is, I would say, somewhat the concept of evil, brought in mind control. But what we said before, which is an important point, is that we all are infected to some degree. And just because somebody makes a mistake, and a public mistake, like celebrities these days, right? They make a lot of mistakes. And we see them now because thanks to social media, we have that influence, and we have insider people, and people are speaking out and being authentic, quote unquote. That's a new trend. These people are just like us. They're fallible. They make mistakes. They're not always in alignment with their values. Even if they've gone to therapy and done all this personal work, they're not in alignment. So how do we help start bridging the gap? Because I've been on both sides of the fence. When I was a little kid, I was indoctrinated into evangelical religion. Short story, I was like, when I finally was listening to all the great things about Jesus and blah, 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 and how he treated poor people and all that, I was paying attention. But then the way the Christians treated each other was like, what? And how they treated other people, even worse. I was like, what is this? Different podcast. Then I went deep into the left-wing activism in college. And I'm still, what I would call myself is a person who is trying to do the right thing now. I don't label myself, but I was deeply in the left progressive. And I was like, okay, so we've left the status quo here, but the way we're treating people that are in the status quo is horrible. We're name calling them. We're shaming. How could you not see this, you idiot? You're stupid. We're smarter than you. We're better than you. I'm like, that's the same self-righteousness that the Christians were doing because they believe in this mythology. It's the same thing. It's just the opposite wing. So how do we then, and this is a big question, I guess you have to read the book, but I want to let you close. How do we work on ourselves, work on the people around us, and to be able to take not only personal change, but systemic change that is so needed right now as we face a multitude of crises in the world?
Yeah, the good news is that it's really easy to get overwhelmed, right? It's really easy to look at the problems in the world and be like, oh my God, there's climate change. There's pervasive racism. We've got wars going on all over now. It's very easy to get overwhelmed and to and feel like we have to take on one issue at a time, and to see these issues as sort of connected, but not be sure how, but distinct. The good news is that when you commit to building relational literacy, to becoming a more relationally healthy person yourself, which includes, of course, building effective communication skills, everything changes. Like once you commit to building relational literacy and you improve your own level of relational literacy, you are automatically contributing to a better world. And the way that you move through the world is going to become appreciably different if you increase your relational skills. Now, individuals alone, building relational literacy are not going to end wars. I'm not naive enough to say that. I will say, however, that if our collective level of relational literacy were not so low, if we weren't living in the relational dark ages, we would not vote for relationally dysfunctional leaders or relationally toxic policies. So this is really, really fundamental. I would also say to, so work on yourself, obviously, and especially if you're already engaged, and you're already trying to do something to help the world, you're an advocate in some way, shape, or form. Remember, the perfect is the enemy of the good. You don't have to do everything in order to do something. You just look at, like, there's a website, 80,000 hours, and it guides people through making choices that are high impact choices to help end social problems, that I highly recommend. Whatever sort of issue you're working, if you're an advocate, you're working toward helping resolve, just remember that this is a piece of a broader whole, and that all of us working for various forms of justice, our meta mission, our higher mission is to create a more relational world. Like that's what we're all working to do. So one thing that people can, I really, really recommend is that people do build awareness of these other problematic systems, because nobody has enough time in the day to work for every single issue, obviously, but we can work for our own issue without throwing others under the bus. You can work for, human liberation without eating animals in the process, or just, reducing your consumption of animals. You can work for animal liberation, without, using sexist, outreach methods, or, sort of racist communication. Like we can all work more effectively together if we are all aware of how these systems are structured and the mentality that we've all inherited, and start to really unravel that. Awareness is really, really the key. And that's one of the big goals for my book, is that, to really shine a light on these systems. It's not rocket science. Once you see them, once you see the way that they operate and the way that they affect your mind, you're much less likely to be hijacked by them.
That is a wonderful summary. And for everyone, the book is How to End Injustice Everywhere by Dr. Melanie Joy. I'm also a big proponent of therapy if you can afford it. If you can't afford it, try to find a mentor, try to find a support group, because the processes are dual. Like you were saying, find something that you want to invest in if you can. You can't do it all, but also work on yourself in the process, and that's going to help create the change that we need as humans to evolve into a species that can maintain our habitat better. I think that's kind of what
I would also add that, you don't have to be like an activist to help activism and change. You can donate, like, organizations that are doing this work. Like there are great organizations that are doing incredible work, and they can't do what they do without support. So donate, you can go to 80,000 hours. You can find an organization who's doing good work. Look up at effective altruism. Basically looks at the different types of work that's being done and makes recommendations for charities. Support the people who are already doing the work.
That is a wonderful point. And I really appreciate everything you've said. The links to your book and your website and everything will be in the show notes. And thank you so much, Dr. Melanie Joy, for joining me today.
Thanks. It's really been a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
And there you have it. This has been another episode of the Intentional Clinician podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please share it with people you know. I would surely appreciate it. Or take just a minute to give us a rating on iTunes. As most of you know, I am passionate about preventing future violence in the United States. My colleagues and I have started a nonprofit called the National Violence Prevention Hotline, a 501c3 organization. We are endeavoring to gain funding and collaborators so that we can start a 24/7 hotline and chat line to reach potential perpetrators before they act violently. It is a bold effort to save lives and curb violence by working to connect with potential offenders while they are in the planning stages of violence, help to de-escalate them, and provide resources so that they can get appropriate professional help. The National Violence Prevention Hotline is looking to open up a conversation about violence in society, the causes, and the solutions. You can learn more by visiting our website, www.violencepreventionhotline.org. Join us online by signing our petition on the website, sharing the website with your network of people, donating to the cause if you like, and you can now even write your congressperson from our website with a simple form. I've said it before and I'll say it again. If you are a therapist looking for ethical and excellent medical billing services, check out therapistbillingservicesllc.com. That's www.therapistbillingservicesllc.com. Billing services created by therapists for therapists. If you're looking for an EMDR International Association consultant, I am a consultant and I can provide you the 20 hours you need to become EMDRIA certified. I have groups online and in person, and I do individual consultation. Just send me a message at the website and I'll get back to you. If you want to get trained in EMDR therapy, check out the great training opportunities with EMDR Training Solutions. I've worked with them before and they are phenomenal, so register today. If you are in need of counseling, do not hesitate to make an appointment at a local counseling center in your area. You can also make an appointment with the excellent clinicians in the Grand Rapids, Michigan area at Health for Life Counseling and the Trauma Informed Counseling Center of Grand Rapids by visiting www.healthforlifegr.com. The recording you just listened to consists of the personal opinions of Paul Krauss and his guest, and while these are based on the literature they have read and the experience in their fields, this should not be viewed as a definitive opinion on any subject. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for treatment. If you're in a crisis, please dial 911 or the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 988. You can also text 741-741 and a live trained crisis counselor will respond. Did you know you could support your local bookstore by shopping at www.bookshop.org? You can order from the comfort of your own home online while supporting local brick and mortar businesses near you. If you are a therapist and you are not a member of your national or local therapy organizations such as the American Counseling Association or the American Mental Health Counselors Association, please get involved, at least pay the dues. It will help the lobbyists in our field keep us from becoming gig workers. And of course, there's the bonus of increasing mental health education around the United States and helping people understand what counseling is and promoting best practices within our profession. Until next time, I wish you all a safe and peaceful week.